Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. Our topic is securing APIs like your business depends on it. And to be candid, more and more, just about every business out there is dependent on APIs in some shape or form. I mean, without APIs, sales stop and data flows fail. And if those APIs are breached, customer and company data will be lost and even worse, sold to the highest bidder. So that's one of the many reasons this event is so timely and so important. On this event, you'll learn about the state of APIs that are driving applications in 2021 and beyond. You'll find out key API security risks that are driving breaches, and most importantly, what you can do to secure your APIs. So in just a moment, I'll introduce you to our expert panelists from Cloudflare and Forrester Research. But first, there's a few things that you should know about the event. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as your moderator. As always, we want these events to be educational. We're all former IT professionals here at Actual Tech Media, and we know how tough it can be out there in the world of enterprise IT. We encourage your questions. We even have a best question prize to help encourage those questions even more. And we'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of the event with our expert presenters. So keep your questions coming in during the presentation and discussion today. We also have a resource there in the handouts tab I want to call your attention to. It is a link on how to get started with Cloudflare. So make sure that you check that out before you go. And then finally, at the end of the webinar today, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card door prize. If you're watching this on demand, of course, the drawing will have already occurred. The prize terms can be found right there in the handouts tab. And then, as I mentioned, we also have our best question prize for an Amazon $50 gift card for the best question submitted on the event today. We'll be contacting the prize winner of that best question gift card after the event. And of course, you still must meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. And with that, I'm excited now to introduce you to our expert presenters. Welcome Daniel Gould, Director of Product Marketing at Cloudflare, Neil Patel, Senior Technical Marketing Manager at Cloudflare, and Sandy Carielli, Principal Analyst for Forrester Research. Let me now bring in our expert panelists, Dan, Neil, and Sandy. It's great to have you. Take it away.
Sounds good, David. Thanks a million for the introduction. Hello. Welcome to everybody. My name is Dan from Cloudflare, as David mentioned. We appreciate you joining us today as we discuss keeping APIs safe, secure, and productive because indeed our businesses depend on them. Now, as David mentioned, I'm joined by Neil Patel here, one of my esteemed colleagues and our technical marketing engineers. Also, we have Sandy Carielli from Forrester as our guest speaker. We're thrilled to have Sandy on the webinar with us today. So
Hi,
that
Dan.
said, let's get going. Hey, Sandy. Good to see you. So very quickly, before we dive in, we'll want to give a brief run of show. We'll take a quick look at Cloudflare. And then, of course, as David mentioned, we'll look at the current API landscape as viewed from our Cloudflare network. And naturally, we'll then hear from Sandy Carielli on some of the trends she's seeing in API security at present. And then we'll briefly discuss Cloudflare API Shield, our API security offering. And then Neil will show us a handful of capabilities from API Shield in action in a demo. So last note, gang, I know we've all done this before, so Q&A is open. Please throw your questions in there, and we can make our way through at the end. So let's dive in. And we'd like to begin many of our conversations by grounding them in our mission. Let's make sure the slides advance here. And that mission, of course, is to build a better internet because it guides much of what we do. And when we say a better internet, we mean one that's faster, one that's more secure, that's more reliable for everybody. And really a key aspect to pursuing this mission is building an unrivaled global cloud network. And that really serves as our foundation. And when we say global cloud network, we're talking about one that can really let organizations secure and accelerate their applications. Pivot to a zero trust security posture, even pivot to cloud delivered networking and security, and even serverless applications. And really what's unique about our network is that all of our services, be it performance or security, run in each and every data center. So we've effectively standardized our services across our entire network. So really what this means is we can offer a single pass inspection, as we call it, within 100 milliseconds of really any employee or any web visitor, effectively anywhere in the world. And when we look at our network on the whole, its entire network surface is north of 90 terabits of DDoS protection, which, as we may know, is many, many, many times larger than the largest DDoS attack we've seen on record. And so when we combine the scale of our network with the speed and reliability of our Anycast routing, our customers effectively enjoy a 100% global uptime, SLA. And look, last point here, and I'll stop talking about the Cloudflare network. We do, as part of our mission, find it very, very important to ensure that there's never a trade-off between security and performance, that organizations are never forced to choose. So that means we feel that organizations must be both the fastest and the most secure. So last slide on Cloudflare here before we jump into some trends on APIs. And you can see with our cloud network as our foundation, we can offer a powerful, broad array of services. Now we see here, Cloudflare for Teams, which is our zero trust security suite. We see in the middle our network services, which is networking as a service, WAN as a service, and of course, what we're here to talk about today in the upper right, application services, which is both application performance, things like CDN and DNS, and of course, application security, which is WAF and bot management, and of course, API security. Suffice to say, we're quite proud of everything we can do with our global cloud network. So let's get into some of the trends we're seeing today with global APIs. And we thought, before we get into more specifics on API security, it would make sense to understand the current state of APIs in the world. And that would really sort of, I think, shed some light on why we need more dedicated API security. And to do this, we've actually teamed with Cloudflare Radar. And they are our crack team of data scientists who really harness insights from our global network to unearth internet trends. And in this case, of course, we're looking at the state of APIs. And we wonder somewhat tongue-in-cheek, like, are APIs living their best 2021 life? Well, let's take a look. And, we figure it probably makes sense to start at the top. And we start with global API usage, as we can see here. And we do this to really understand the importance APIs have in the world and the role they play in business. And Sandy, you'll touch on this I think in your piece too. But, no kidding, APIs to a large extent make the world go round, or at least applications, right? And we see them, of course, they're powering web applications, but what's more, they're powering mobile apps, right? IoT, the real growth areas of the internet today. So ultimately, when we take this into account, we see that half the traffic today on Cloudflare, half the traffic is API related, half. So of course, this means there's a large emerging attack surface we have to account for in our application security postures, which obviously we're here to discuss. And this is not lost, and Sandy, I believe you'll touch on this too. This is not lost on attackers, as it turns out, for better or for worse. So that's another reason that brings us here today. And so, something that comes up quite a bit, and Sandy, I think you and I were talking about this, is when we say API related, what does that really mean, right? When we're talking about API traffic. And, this brings us back to one of everybody's favorite topics, HTTP headers. And, and naturally Cloudflare, we're quite fond of these, but really we're looking for, when we're defining what API traffic is, we're looking for a couple of headers and the presence of a data format in those headers. So we look at headers like content type or accept headers, which really define the data type going from the client to the server, or the data type that the client is expecting back from the server. And in those headers, we're looking for things like JSON as a data format or XML. And when we see those data formats in place, that, of course, would indicate that this is API traffic, API-related traffic. So it comes up quite a bit. We're looking for JSON and XML, and that really lets us know that this is API traffic. And of course, running this analysis, we see, again, half the traffic on the Cloudflare network today is API-related. So as we move on here, and I think today we probably have somewhat of a self-selecting group who think a lot about APIs and API security. So perhaps this won't stun anybody, the stat here, but year over year, we've seen an increase of some 61% of API traffic on the Cloudflare network. And this is both the fact that, of course, we're growing, we're adding new customers who may well be more API first, API centric. So a good chunk of their traffic may be API related. And also, though, we see customers who've been with us for the longer term who are using APIs to a greater extent. So when you take these two things together, we do see some pretty good growth at 61% of API traffic year over year. Now, here's the interesting stat. And when we compare API traffic with web traffic, we do see some pretty incredible growth. And perhaps astounding, perhaps not, we do see this 660% number when API traffic is compared to the growth of web traffic. Now, initially I had to double check these numbers with our data scientists because they look pretty incredible. But when we think about what we just mentioned, right? APIs are largely tied to the growth of mobile apps, mobile traffic, IoT. And so sort of these fast growing aspects of the internet are largely tied to APIs. Well, maybe this stat doesn't seem so astounding. Maybe this is just the state of global APIs. All right. So we also wanted to know, hey, we're looking at these APIs and the growth of this topic. Who are the major culprits, right? Who are the biggest champions of APIs? And who is really growing fastest in their use of APIs? So we analyzed the data we had, and we've been able to come up with a couple of perspectives here. And we see here on the left, this colored bar chart. And these are effectively the industries most heavily using APIs today. And probably not surprising, we see the internet software category or industry as the sort of biggest user of APIs. And now, this doesn't seem terribly surprising, in that, of course, these are the organizations building applications, which of course have APIs involved, right? In their tech strategy, in their business strategy. So that's probably not a huge surprise. However, we do see some other industries here, like crypto, like gaming, marketing, entertainment, right? So there's some interesting sort of other industries here that we see on our network using APIs heavily. And I initially was like, I got the data back and I was wondering, what's an API, and what's entertainment? And right, and we think about something like IMDb, and there's sort of this vast trove of Hollywood data, right? Now, it turns out there are a lot of places or other, sites who might want to use this data. And so that's where an entertainment API would come into place to share this data around the internet. Ditto for marketing, where you're maybe managing ads and marketing campaigns via APIs, right? So these are other industries heavily using APIs today. Now, we see on the right a chart that really shows us who's growing fastest, and crypto is at the top of the list. And maybe this doesn't surprise anybody. New marketplaces, new exchanges, and people largely buying and selling crypto from their phones. So, maybe this isn't a huge surprise. And then, of course, we see internet and software further down the list, given the fact that they started from a more mature place, last year and years prior, meaning they're growing a little bit slower. But, this is a snapshot, Sandy, from our side of the world, from our network. What your conversations, your trends, what are you seeing in terms of industries and APIs?
What's interesting here, Dan, I've looked at our technographics data in terms of API security tooling adoption and planned adoption. And, I'm looking at here where you're noting the cryptocurrency had a huge growth in API traffic. Well, financial services overall, not just cryptocurrency, but just financial services across the board, is one of the top adopters of API security. And, that kind of makes sense. They're a huge API user as well. Other industries where I'm seeing a lot of API security adoption and growth, utilities, telecom. Areas where I'm seeing less, got to tell you, healthcare and public sector are still behind in this space. And that's where, we really need to see them step it up a little bit.
I would say so. We'll get to some examples later. We'll talk about this. And that's actually a little alarming, but I guess, hopefully there's some healthcare people with us today that are thinking about this.
Yeah.
I will say the utilities jumps out. I didn't anticipate utilities being a sort of an industry that's adopting API security, but I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, no, they're along with telecom. That's an industry that seems to be on the moving faster side of the spectrum, I'd say.
That's awesome, because oftentimes, and this maybe they're sort of the much maligned utilities you hear about, the local utilities that might be running, Windows 95, some old server
Right.
that's been out of service, and like there are no patches and it's delicate and they don't want to touch it. But this is actually really reassuring to hear that. So really, really good stuff. So we'll keep moving here, and with some broader trends out of the way, we also wanted to take a slightly deeper look at API traffic and looking at things like formats and methods to see what we can glean from these trends for security. And we were, for starters, curious about the data formats in use. And, we figured JSON would take the day, and lo and behold, it does. And by the way, when we say data formats, it's really sort of the agreed upon format that like the client and the server will use to share data back and forth. And we see here on the slide things like JSON, which won't surprise anybody, and of course XML, which is an older sort of data format used with some legacy, we'll call them APIs. So lo and behold, JSON leads the way, and as we figured, it comprises nearly all the traffic. Now there is that sliver of XML you see there at the top, and we did notice, and this is probably true to sort of the way REST APIs are built and SOAP APIs, but the payloads or the bodies, if you will, for the XML traffic were much heavier, much larger, and than the JSON. But this being the case, we do see a sliver of XML, Sandy. Like, did you hear this? Does this XML still come up in your conversations? Where do you see this, or if at all?
Yeah, I do see XML. In fact, I remember when we looked at this slide, I was surprised that XML was such a thin sliver of it, because I think I hear it more frequently than would be expected given how little it shows up in your overall traffic. But I think the reality behind that, Dan, is that a lot of newer companies that built API first in the past 5 years, they went with RESTful APIs. They went with JSON. They didn't have all of the legacy. Any organization that's going further back 10, 15, 20 years, there's still some legacy XML in there. And they may have since developed a lot of RESTful APIs, but there's still some legacy stuff that they have to support. I would say, thinking aloud, I would say that there's, 20 to 30% of my calls from customers who are asking about API security, at least, have some amount of XML requirement. Most of them have a hybrid. I have spoken to a couple where it's primarily XML and SOAP. That's not the norm, but it's more common that there is some amount of XML than would be implied by the traffic that you're seeing. And I think the reality is that that leftover legacy that's going to persist for a while.
Yeah, indeed. I suppose if it isn't broken, no need to fix it, right? And imagine these are probably more mature organizations who've been, relying on APIs for a while as part of their tech business strategy. So they're getting in touch on API security. So interesting stuff. So we also actually wanted to look at, as we say, sort of the methods to API madness here. And, we were somewhat curious, like what is the most common API call, or at least API call method? And can we learn anything about security from these findings? And probably no surprise, we see here post and gets are the most common, and they comprise, I think, 97.5% of the API calls we see. Now, post here we see is half of all traffic, and we sort of wonder what implications, why does that matter for security? Well, we think about like a post request, right? And that means, there's header and there's a body with data in it, right? It's JSON probably. And that means half of the requests, 1 out of 2, have the power, if you will, to sort of change something on the back end, right? They're sending data in, and this could uncover some potential issues, right? This could be modifying data. This could be like mass assignment, where maybe they add a parameter and hope they, send it through and see what happens. Or maybe just simply exposing like some back-end problems, vulnerabilities, right? Be it them intentional or not. And so that is interesting in and of itself, that half of the traffic we see is a post request, meaning there's data that's being sent to the backend. And something else, and Sandy, this, I think when we think about this through the lens of industries, becomes somewhat concerning, or maybe, that's why we're here today to think about API security, is we think about a post request, right? There is a body and it does have data. And as you said, like, be it financial services, healthcare, a lot of this data is sensitive, it's regulated, and it's being sort of, communicated shared via APIs back and forth with the request and response, right? And so when you think about this, that we see a lot of post requests with bodies, and it may well be sensitive information, payment information, healthcare, PII, authentication. I think the need for dedicated API security really starts to come into focus, right? Where this is, there's a lot of sort of the problems we're familiar with the application security that they're also true to APIs, and also sort of data security if there's a really sensitive data going back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Dan.
And so let me bring this home here with one last finding around API security. And judging from what we could find, we wanted to suss out any trends we could see with respect to API security practices on our networks. So we effectively we looked at encryption and encryption's use in API, right? And this is HTTPS. And gang, it's hard to escape the gaping hole on the slide we're all staring at right now, that you see this light blue sort of portion of the pie that says 30% indeed has no encryption in place. And we just talked about industries with sensitive data being used, that are being communicated via APIs. And it's hard to know that indeed, unfortunately, the traffic we see today, 30% is actually unencrypted. And that's tough to stomach, particularly given the fact that something at Cloudflare we've done, and we've sought to make encryption, PKI, really easy, really simple, headache-free, and even free of charge. And there are a lot of other organizations on the internet doing the same thing. So I guess that means we still need to keep preaching sort of this gospel of encryption. Now, looking at the glass half full, of course, this means that 70% of the traffic we see is indeed encrypted. And we see the most common encryption package today is TLS 1.3, which, as we know, is the most current iteration of TLS, which is indeed a good thing. Now, one little finding we did see, and I've got a pun for the group here, we see quickly growing in adoption. And Quick is as we may know, is a sort of a general purpose transport layer protocol, which also includes, applies encryption. So we do see support for Quick growing quite a bit, growing quite quickly. Now, last slide here, and this really looks at how we're trending year over year with respect to encryption. Now, we have another unfortunate glass half empty finding here, and we see, unfortunately, in 2021, we see less encryption than last year. And that's tough to stomach, just based on the things we've just said. We're thinking a lot about encryption, how to make it easy, how to make it free. And unfortunately, we do see more traffic that's unencrypted. And it's not vastly more, but it is a little bit more. Now, fortunately, the one good finding, positive finding here is, in fact, people are moving to TLS 1.3 from 1.2 to make sure they're using the most current standard, which is really important. And now, really, with that is our background on APIs, Sandy. Or not just the state of APIs. I'd like to hear from you about some of the trends we're seeing in API security. So I guess I'll turn it over to you now, and we'll lead it to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. And as we're starting to talk about APIs, let's remember that APIs ultimately are building blocks for applications. So let's start out with the reality here. When you look at breaches that are due to external attacks, applications are still the most common way in. We've been running this same question in Forrester Technographics survey for years. And year after year after year, applications are, top one or top two most common ways in for external attackers. This has just been sort of an ongoing issue, either, through web applications here, 39% of respondents said that an external attack was carried out due to a flaw in a web application like SQL injection or cross-site scripting. And then another 30% said software vulnerabilities, potentially issues in open source software or other components helped an attacker get in. So applications are a common way in, and APIs are unfortunately part of that. That's the bad news. The good news is that firms are recognizing this, and they're actually prioritizing application security. The single piece of data that had me the most optimistic this year was this piece, that the top tactical priority for security leaders in the next 12 months was improving application security. Thank you. That's exactly what we need to see. And in fact, even in the top 10, further down at 21%, building security into the development process is there. So we're going in the right direction. Now, I'm actually really curious for you, Dan, what you're hearing from your customers about priorities. Does that match what we're seeing?
To a large extent, it does, right? And we end up talking to a lot of people about application security. So I feel like the need for a WAF is, people understand that loud and clear.
Yeah.
They know that there are tons of vulnerabilities out there. They know that there are new sort of concerns, right? There are breach credentials on the dark web, right? That might be those enterprise credentials, right? And they'll need sort of the WAF to take care of that. However, there are sort of emerging areas, which is really why we're talking more and more about it, like API security. We do have to, I think, sort of push a little bit heavier. And I think you will get into this and talk about it a bit more, where some of the more progressive organizations, or maybe who've been using APIs for a while, are aware of this, but some who are just pushing APIs in production, maybe they haven't quite realized the security risk or the fact that OWASP has created their own top 10 for APIs. And so I think at the high level, sort of the application security, we definitely see people understanding the need now more than ever for something like a WAF, but dedicated API security. Sometimes they might initially almost wave us off. And this is something we really do need to sort of preach more and more. Now, I wonder, as I see this, and this is actually really heartening to see, do you see, Sandy, at the top there, we see that 28% of security leaders looking to bolster application security. Do you feel like as part of that, are they also scrutinizing the vendors they buy applications from for better application sort of DevSecOps, to make sure that they're buying rock solid applications that have been not brought to market sort of in a rush?
You mean, are they asking about the secure development processes?
Exactly.
It's a good question. Maybe some of the most mature organizations are starting to have those types of questions in the RFPs. I don't know if that's necessarily top of process yet, but one of the things that we saw from the executive order that the Biden administration released last month was a push towards software bill of materials. And I think that's going to extend into the private sector as well, where organizations are going to start asking, what was your application made of? So I think there is a degree to which we're going to continue to see more and more of this.
Yeah, and I mean that has to be positive. I mean, I know that it's not only web application attacks, API attacks, but just supply chain attacks more broadly have us all on edge, and they have for the past year.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good thing.
And the interesting thing here with APIs that I'm not sure I've mentioned, you mentioned earlier the growth in API traffic. I suppose not surprisingly, we've seen a similar growth in API vulnerabilities. There's some research that BugCrowd published last year, and they publish information about, the number of vulnerabilities and issues that their researchers have found and reported. And API findings almost doubled. So as they're finding all these vulnerabilities in applications, they're finding them even more aggressively in API related issues. It's definitely something that is still a problem. So, and that sort of aligns with what we have here. APIs have become a prime target for attackers. One of the things that we're going to be talking about are the myriad number of well-known API-based attacks that we've seen over the last year or so. And you'll see, I joke about it a little bit later. I can't keep up in terms of having decks that have all the latest, because there's always a report of a new API-based breach. It's one of the most common ways in. So it definitely speaks to the need for us to pay much closer attention to that vector to make sure that we are protecting ourselves properly. And this goes back to some of what you were saying before. APIs offer huge boons to organizations, right? They're ways to engage your customers and your partners in different ways. I like to talk about the Philips Hue because I think it's a fun example. They set up a whole developer portal. People can program their lights to, flash on at, different times of day, to flash in the colors of their favorite sports teams, all sorts of both useful and goofy stuff. And it creates customer loyalty. It builds new revenue streams. It allows you to create new products and new offerings more quickly. So there's a great speed to market opportunity. But at the same time, if you're putting all this out there and you're not securing it, that's where the problem lies. And so, what we've seen is the number of public APIs out there, not surprising based on the traffic that you're seeing, huge number of developers are dealing with public APIs. 23% said that their organizations have public-facing ones, and then another 22% say that their organizations have B2B, partner-related ones, for passing data back and forth between some of their most trusted partners and collaborators. So there are all of these ways in which, as you were talking about, data is being shared in new and useful ways, both internally and externally and across the organization. And that's what we have to pay attention to then. The reality is we are exposing a tremendous amount of information to the internet, much more than we ever had before. And in fact, look at this, 33% of organizations are, exposing, a huge number of their apps to third-party services through APIs. So you start to see, APIs are the way that organizations are reaching the market. And with that exposure, that's where the risk comes in, right?
Indeed.
So
I love
this is what I was joking about with you earlier. Yeah. And I will say this came up in part because I was updating the deck for this presentation. And I started to look through and be like, all these, some of these breaches are a little bit out of date. I know there have been more recently. And Dan, I started to look through it and it's like, here's one and here's one and here's one.
Yeah.
They don't all fit on the slide. It's really depressing. I have so many good stories to tell. And on the one hand, okay, as an analyst, great, I have great stories to tell. I can, make it real to a lot of people. On the other hand, wouldn't it be nice if I didn't have as many good stories to tell?
Yeah, it would be.
And
nice.
that is what we're facing. And I'm actually really curious, and maybe some of those that are in the audience will chime in about how many of these they've heard of. We have here two different exercise bike companies, both Peloton and Echelon. Both of them had similar leaky API issues that were allowing attackers to grab their customers' private data or account data. In the case of Peloton, even if your account was private, you were able to grab someone's account data because of how the API was configured, where there wasn't appropriate authentication on it. And Echelon also allowed for a tremendous amount of account data. LinkedIn is an interesting one because the LinkedIn API didn't allow you to pull private data, but it allowed you to very easily scrape a huge amount of public-facing user information. And you might ask, well, so what? It's all out there publicly anyway. Why do we care? Well, you don't want to be able to make it easier for the attackers and for the fraudsters, right? And what the attackers are doing with that data is they're pulling it in bulk. They're pulling it quickly through the API, and then they're selling it and leveraging it in future fraud attacks. They're finding people that work for specific organizations or have particular profiles, and then they are formulating different types of targeted fraud and other types of attacks leveraging that data. So yes, it's all public, but if you use the API and we're able to get this all quickly, why in the world would we make it easier for the attackers? That's the challenge, right?
And these are all, again, from the past few months. Like this is been a problem for actually years now. And as we see the growth of APIs, if we don't take dedicated API security a little more seriously, I'm afraid Sandy's going to have she's going to have to put more slides in her decks, tracking attacks.
Everything on this slide is from this year. Yeah. I'd really rather not update one for the second half of this year with a whole new set of issues.
And the biggest companies we're all aware of have fallen prey to API breaches, where there was appropriate security development in place to build good APIs or have security in place once it's in development.
There was just last week one related to Microsoft Power Apps. These are sort of a constant ongoing issue that we have to be paying attention to. The John Deere one is kind of interesting because you don't often think about a farm equipment tractor supply company as, being a potential target or rife for this type of attack, but they have a number of APIs as well. And attackers were able to, or in this case, a security researcher found it, and it was actually plugged within a couple of days, thank goodness. But they realized that they were able to get information about equipment owners and get that personal data. And, again, that's the type of data you really don't want someone to be able to get. You don't want to get that notice that, oh, we care about your privacy, and by the way, we happen to lose your data. Nobody likes that. So I'm curious, Dan, what challenges are your customers facing? I've thrown out a bunch of examples here of sob stories, but I'm sure you have some as well.
So, and I think we're talking about this a little bit before, and we'll touch on this. So there are two key sort of challenges or just uncertain areas that seem to come up quite often. And the first is, hey, we're using APIs, we're starting to use them more and more in production. How do we keep track of them?
Yep.
Right. And so they ask us about API visibility and discovery, and that comes up a lot. And, sometimes I think the expression is cliche, but it seems to be true no matter how we think about security. If you can't see it, you can't protect it. Yep. And so this is very, very true with APIs. And we think about the risks here. If you don't have the appropriate sort of inventory for all of your APIs, this is where things like shadow or rogue APIs become a problem, where they maybe have been pushed in production and they're not being monitored, or perhaps there are some breaking changes. You roll out a new API, new version, and then you leave the old one in production sort of unmonitored, right? And that's sort of a shadow rogue API. So without the right API visibility, that is a big problem. And so a lot of organizations who are starting to use APIs more and more think about that. Now, the other one you were just talking about, the other sort of concern that comes up a lot is around authentication. And we've actually had, and this is why I said everything always new again. We've actually had questions from customers saying, "Hey, do we need authentication on our API endpoints?"
Like, oh dear. Yeah.
Yeah. You probably should.
Yeah.
At least some basic put something on there. Do we need authentication? So that is something we've actually thought a lot about too, to help with particularly mobile and IoT instances, to make sure that there's the right authentication in place, because that really is still an important security layer, to make sure that only the sort of authorized, authenticated, outside parties are able to connect and make API calls. So visibility and authentication are two of the big concerns that come up time and again. And I think as we think about some of these challenges, we some other areas we have to sort of preach a little bit more about API abuse and even almost like a DLP sort of thing. But right now today, visibility and authentication tend to be the big sort of concerns that come up.
Makes sense. I mean, if you look at the OWASP API top 10, poor authorization, broken authorization is number one. It's there for a reason. And so many of the breaches that I hear about are due to authentication and authorization issues. Exactly. That's unfortunately where things are at.
And there's a big one where, please keep going.
No, go ahead. So, I mean, what I'll say here as a bit of good news, again, people are paying attention, and we are seeing organizations adopting API security at different stages of the life cycle. The dark green that you see here are those firms that say they're planning to implement API security at this stage in the next 12 months, and the light green are the ones that have already done so. What you see here, Dan, is that there's been a lot of implementation of API security in production and in testing, but a lot of the investment in the next year is going to be more on the testing side and then the development side. So we're starting to, as they say, shift further left. And, that speaks to making sure that we're identifying these issues earlier in the life cycle, and hopefully, not deploying rogue APIs, understanding the way that APIs are built and the parameters in there before we just get them out there, making sure that we're addressing, authentication and authorization. So we are seeing some progress.
Right? Yeah, you need both sides
of that
coin. You need both sides of that coin in building strong, well-built APIs that have all the appropriate sort of security in place, and they don't have vulnerabilities, and some protection when they're in production.
That is a fabulous segue to this point, and this is kind of the crux of the point that I really like to make when I talk about API security. This is not a single point problem. You have to look at APIs the way you look at applications, as something that has to be protected throughout the life cycle. You're not going to protect APIs in one place. You're not going to necessarily protect APIs. You're not going to do it with a single tool. You really need to embed API security into your entire planning and, sounds a little corny to say, but consciousness, right? You need to be thinking about how you're going to protect APIs during design, during development, all the way through deployment. How are you going to protect them in production? And when they're in production, what are the protections that you have in place at at all the layers, coming in through client side, but then all the way through to infrastructure. What are you doing in terms of rate limiting and authentication and authorization and microsegmentation and analyzing the parameters and all of that to make sure that you are protecting the APIs appropriately. This is not a point solution. So, ultimately, where does that leave us? You actually hit it on the head earlier when you were talking about your customers really asking about what was there and needing that discovery. I would say that discovery is one of the top questions I get with respect to APIs. So step number one just has to be that API inventory and making sure you know what's in your environment. And yeah, as you said, Dan, it sounds a little cliched, it sounds a little boring because it's no different from inventory your keys, inventory your identities, inventory your certificates. It's everything old is new again. But this is the important stuff. The next thing to realize is, APIs are subject to a lot of those same vulnerabilities that traditional web applications are dealing with. We've talked about authentication and authorization. We've been dealing with this for years. It looks a little different with APIs, but, we still need to be paying attention to that. And then there are additional issues that are more specific to APIs that we also have to pay attention to. And ultimately, the final point that I really like to make with respect to APIs, this isn't a silver bullet. We need to look at all of our tooling and see how it addresses APIs. Look at our typical application security tools and ask, hey, are they designed to also scan our APIs, protect our APIs? When we are checking application traffic, are we also checking the API traffic, or are we dropping that? So really making sure that we are thinking about this holistically and looking at the journey of the API in the same way that we've looked at the journey through the application, since we've been dealing with application security for 20 plus years, right?
Indeed. Good stuff.
So yeah, I think I will turn it back over to you now.
All right, awesome. Well, that was great, Sandy, and thank you. And I would love to come back to in the Q&A any war stories that you can share, about maybe some API fails that, we should just all bear in mind. But yeah, that
Absolutely.
was great. And I feel like that's, it's a really good segue into how Cloudflare is thinking about API security with our API Shield product. And we'll spend a little bit of time just talking about the product. And then Neil's going to actually walk us through some of the capabilities. He'll show us that. And we see here a high-level summary of Cloudflare API Shield. And you see some of the big benefits. Understanding your API endpoint estate at all times. That's the API visibility, the API discovery we've been talking about. Of course, making sure the right authentication is in place, of course, right? To ensure that only the people who should be making API calls are indeed doing so. And of course, we want to make sure that we can pivot to a positive security model for our APIs. And we'll talk more about that on the next slide. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we can take care of abuse, block abuse, hitting our API endpoints, and even as we've spoken about before, make sure that any sensitive data is protected, right? And as our head of engineering is fond of saying, in security, we need to keep the bad stuff out and the good stuff in. So the last thing we want is a data leak via an API response. So how do we more specifically think about security in API Shield? Well, let's look at the layers that we package together for API defense and depth. And we start here on the left. And you might be familiar with Cloudflare and the fact that we think a lot about DDoS. Naturally, that's where we start. Network level and application layer DDoS protection. But specifically for APIs, of course, we begin with the API discovery. And we'll see that in a minute. And of course, we want to make sure we've got an up-to-the-minute snapshot of all the APIs we have in production. Then, of course, we think about authentication. And particularly, as we said before, IoT and mobile apps are really part and parcel with APIs. So we want to make sure we have the right authentication in place, particularly for those vectors. Now, we also want to make sure in the cases where like basic auth is being used, username and password, that we're also scanning for compromised credentials. We know that, unfortunately, there's a lot of breaches and a lot of password combinations end up on the dark web. Want to make sure we're taking care of those and scanning for those. Now, this is really interesting. This is really important to really, I would say fundamental to good API security. And that's this positive API security model. And that's using the API schema, sort of as a security template we can enforce against. And, I think of the API schema in sort of the spirit of oversimplifying as sort of the ground rules the developers lay out for how you're allowed to interact with APIs. And of course, it's very strict about what API calls are allowed, methods, all sorts of things. And we can then use that schema as effectively a security template. And basically what we do is we upload that schema and we only allow traffic that conforms to the schema. So it's almost like zero trust for APIs. Everything is blocked except for what conforms to the schema. And this can be a very, very powerful layer of security to make sure that nobody tries to fiddle with things on the back end or block against vulnerability exploits. And of course, we think also about anomaly detection. And this is where some of our powerful machine learning comes in on our network edge. And of course, we do this to stop API abuse. And we can basically do what we call blocking of volumetric anomalies. And it turns out all API endpoints aren't created the same. And they have different sort of anticipated volumes, if you will. So say if it's during the Super Bowl, there might be an endpoint, API endpoint that does score updates. And that's, of course, going to see a good amount of traffic during the Super Bowl. However, the password reset endpoint won't see the same amount of traffic. So we need to be able to distinguish and understand the anticipated level of traffic for each and every API endpoint, and then block and throttle on that particular volume. And so that way we can actually use our edge network to stop API abuse that's basically a volumetric sort of type of attack. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we also update our rate limiting, which is something we've also done to make sure it's even more appropriate for APIs. Because if we think about rate limiting as sort of blocking or throttling on external IPs, but what happens if that's an authenticated API call? Well, we need some more sophisticated granular ways to block and throttle our rate limiting. So that's something else that you should look for as an updated layer of security. And lastly, we talked about this. There might be API responses that have healthcare information, account info, sensitive data. And we want to make sure that, again, we keep the bad out and the good stuff in. And that's where we actually have a layer of sensitive data detection to make sure that the sensitive data that shouldn't be leaving the company never does via an API response. So I'm going to actually wrap this up here. And as we say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So Neil, why don't we turn it over to you and we can see some of this in action?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. So this has been great so far. We've got a lot of background on what we should be looking for when it comes to API security, right? There's a lot of things that we have to do, and both Sandy and both Dan, and I'm going to say it again, the first step is understanding. I can't protect an API endpoint. I can't protect something if I don't know that it's there. And, these are, common terms and stuff like that we hear in the API security world, zombie APIs, things that kind of dangle and linger and leave yourself open to exposure. So what I'm going to show you first is Cloudflare's API discovery. And what you're looking at here is essentially a fingerprint of your API footprint on the web. So when you use Cloudflare to protect your API endpoints, protect your domain, we actually identify API traffic to that domain and to those endpoints, and we figure out, the method, the actual URI, the actual API endpoint is reaching, the number of requests we've seen. We even do math on the request data to give you a 99th percentile, a 50th percentile, to give you an understanding of what is the most common usage of this API endpoint versus what are some of the outliers that we're seeing. And the value there is it helps you understand a little bit better what that API endpoint might be being used for. And Dan alluded to this when he talked about the Super Bowl, right? If you've got two endpoints, one that's a score update and one that's a password reset, there's going to be a very different, 50th percentile for those two during that time window for that 24-hour period or for that, 1 day period. And so this helps you understand the presence of your API endpoint. So for example, if I'm going to look at everything that is, a post, I can filter out and see what's a post, and I can use it to identify, okay, this is legitimate. This is something that may be old. This is something that I shouldn't have at all. And I can use that to feed back into a development, loop where it says, okay, well, these need to be retired. These need to be removed. And you can see kind of the number of requests in the last 24 hours. So this can also help to understand the activity of an API, right? And the next part about that is understanding and seeing it is great, but how do we act on it? How do we kind of take some control on it? There's a standard, IP-based blocking or, domain or geolocation-based blocking. But we can actually get a little bit more granular with rate limiting rules on APIs by matching on things like the methodology and the URI. So rather than have you write everything out for, to do the rule, you can actually take a view, let's say, for example, we've got this, this post account for groups into my team, my Cloudflare for Teams and Access account. I can actually create a rate limiting rule right from the screen, and you can see it populates the details for that rule, right? It matches that exact endpoint and request, the request methodology, the host name, the URI path, and this is in regex because obviously everyone's going to have a different account ID, or some parameters of the URL are going to vary. They're not going to be the same for everybody. And then you can kind of see here, what do you want to do for the rate limit? So do you want to set only 7 requests in the 10-minute period? If it exceeds that, then what are you going to do with it? So you can tune this to be a 10-second window, a 1-hour window, and then you can take an action, right? So you can straight up block, you can just log and identify, so you can maybe identify some abuse, or you can JS or a CAPTCHA challenge them. So that'll force the request to go through a waiting window, or make sure it's not a bot, right? And then you can do it for a certain period of time. So you can make this only live for a day for that specific rate limit, and then it'll reset, and then it'll keep going. So it's really simple to act and take action on some of the details that you see in the API discovery, right? That's awesome for kind of finding those quiet APIs in the corner that might be exposing yourself to more risk. The second piece of it is actually taking that positive security model that Dan was talking about. How do we make sure that API requests are conforming exclusively to what we say? And that's where API Shield comes in. So what this does is you can actually import API schema from your Swagger Open API, from whatever documentation tool you might be using that kind of takes a schema out, and it's going to import and identify requests and the parameters for those requests. What kind of header should they have? What kind of body should it have? What should the URI endpoint be? What should the methodology be? And it'll match against that and alert you or block or take your pick action when it violates or doesn't match anything there. So for example, I have a very simple API that I've spun up here, and I'm going to show it to you real quick. The first parameter that we can match on for schema validation is host name, and then a myriad of other parameters. So you don't necessarily just have to deploy an API shield globally for a single application. You can deploy a different API shield for different locations, for different regions, for different IP spaces, and you can put the parameters in here in the matching criteria for the API shield rule. In this case, it's just matching on my API endpoint, api.cftmb.com, and pretty much globally for every API request. And then it's a single, right now I'm monitoring a single endpoint. My schema is for the /users endpoint, and the methods are delete, get, and post. And here are the parameters that I'm matching on, right? I need to match on the path, the query, the header, and the cookies. And then anywhere you see a no is where there's no specific criteria to match on. Now, the important piece to that positive security model that we're talking about is the endpoint action and the fall through action. So what this really lets you do is, if something doesn't match exactly what you have defined in your API schema and your API shield, you can actually just terminate it. You can just block it. So therefore, anything that doesn't match exactly what you have said, we're going to block. In this case, I've just logged, and then the endpoint action. So for something that is going against, something that doesn't match exactly on an endpoint, we're going to go ahead and log that as well. But you can also block it. So 2 situations. 1, if it matches an endpoint but doesn't match the criteria. 2, if it doesn't match anything at all. It's just some random web request coming into a URI that may not exist. So what you can see actually is I've as we're talking through this webinar, I've hit the API with a bit of non-official requests, things that don't match and are things that are malformed, and you can see that there is non-compliant activity. So I've got 286,000 in the last 24 hours. That's quite alarming. We would hope you would not see that high of a volume in a short window of time of non-compliant API requests. If you want to dive a little deeper, you can select it, and you can actually go in and look at the window. So you can see it was a really quick spike last night. So something might have been going on. There might have been some active attack, and you can actually filter on the window. You can see the details about the user agents, where they came from, the ASNs, and then you can dive deeper into the request itself. What was the method, the host, the path, if there was a query string. And you can even see details about our bot scoring. So that's also very important, because bots aren't just attacking websites to scrape them. There could be bots attacking your API to try and overload it or try and get data out of the API now, because scraping a web page may not be as effective as just polling the API for user data or inventory data or passwords. So all that data is usable. It's available to you. It's actionable. You can create rules. You can create rate limiting rules, and that's really how we approach and take action on API security, right? Everything that Sandy has talked about, everything that Dan talked about, these are ways that we help you secure that API really quickly, right? You use Cloudflare, traffic comes in, we identify all of the API traffic, we filter it, we tell you about it, what's going on, the volume, the users, and then you can take action on it. You can block, you can log, you can challenge it, and you can go even further by blocking specific requests from specific IPs, specific geolocations with specific header data. Really, however you want to tune and protect your APIs, you have the flexibility there. With that, I'm going to pass it, honestly, back to the open floor. We've got a bit of time here to just Q&A. If there's any specific questions, Sandy, that you and Dan want to answer, let's go ahead and take care of them.
Yeah, David, are there any questions you want to run past us?
Absolutely. Yeah, great presentation. Love the demo. We got a ton of questions coming in from the audience. I'm afraid we won't have time to get to all of them, but maybe just time for a couple of questions. First one here, they're asking, what's the forecast for API security out there? Is it rosy? Do you see fewer APIs with no encryption, more APIs using TLS 1.3? What are the trends?
So I'll tell you what I see. In the same way that organizations have become more aware of application security, they're becoming more aware of API security. And so the more mature organizations are starting to do a better job of buttoning down their APIs. But look, the reality is this is new for a lot of people. And there was a lot of transformation over the last year and a half, and we're still seeing a continuous stream of API-related breaches. So while I would love to say, everything's going to be rosy in 12 months, I don't think we're there. I think we're going to continue to have a learning curve in this. Will there be better encryption? That may be one of the things that we figure out first. But, some of the other issues just around making sure that we've got, the parameters right and the authentication authorization, it's going to take a little while.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Another question here from Chris, who says, there's a number of solutions on the market to help deal with API security and attacks. What makes Cloudflare really unique?
I'll take a pass at that. So we think about how we started our presentation with our global cloud network, and the fact that we actually have a global presence, 200 cities around the world, right? Meaning we are everywhere an organization's employees and web visitors are, making sure that, of course, security and performance is always job one. Now, from our cloud network, we can also deliver all of the application security somebody would need, in addition to Cloudflare API Shield, right? So we can deliver a lot from our global cloud network. Now, what's more is really, you saw that slide with the blue bar in the middle. And the way we've packaged the right capabilities, the right features to keep API secure and productive really makes us unique. And few of other companies are packaging API security and protections in the way we are. So that really makes us unique, Chris.
Excellent. And I think that's a great ending point here for our event. We're running out of time. I want to give a special thanks to Sandy, Daniel, and Neil. Really great presentation and demo. Thank you so much for being on the event today.
Thanks,
David.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sandy.
And of course, thank you to everyone out there in the audience for joining us. Don't forget about the handouts tab right there. There's a link that'll take you to cloudflare.com, and you can easily click on Get Started right there, or Contact Sales and get started with the Cloudflare solution. We encourage everyone to check that out and learn more. Thank you for all the excellent questions. We do appreciate those. We will be contacting our prize winners after the event. And of course, thank you to everyone who joined us on the event today. And with that, I'll just go ahead and announce our final prize winner. This is going out to Fred Schroeder from Illinois for an Amazon $300 gift card. We'll reach out to you. For more information, of course, visit cloudflare.com and learn how to secure your APIs, because your business really does depend on it. Thank you, everyone. I hope you learned a lot, and have a great day. See you next time. Bye-bye.